I never thought my grandmother's 175-year-old windmill would trigger an all-out war with our neighborhood HOA. But when Barbara Hamilton had it demolished while I was on vacation, she had no idea it wasn't just destroying a family heirloom, she was springing a legal trap I'd been setting for months. What would you do if you discovered your neighbor's vendetta wasn't just about property values but about covering up land theft that went back generations? Let me know in the comments where you're watching this neighborhood showdown from, and if you love seeing entitled HOA presidents get exactly what they deserve, hit subscribe so you don't miss my next story. The first time I laid eyes on Hilltop Farm after inheriting it from my grandmother Eleanor Mitchell, I felt like I'd stepped back in time. The massive wooden windmill turned lazily in the afternoon breeze, its blades casting rhythmic shadows across the property. The windmill's weathered oak structure creaked softly as it had for nearly 2 centuries, a living connection to my family's past. This wasn't just a piece of property, it was a legacy. 5 generations of my family had maintained that mill, rebuilt after fires, reinforced after floods, standing as a testament to my family's resilience. My grandmother spent her final years fighting to preserve it, and now that responsibility had passed to me. "It's beautiful," my friend Mia whispered as we stood watching the blades turn. "I can't believe something this old still works." "My great-great-grandfather built it in 1850, I said, running my hand along the rough wooden beams. "Back when this was all farmland. The windmill used to pump water and grind grain for everyone in the county." What I didn't realize that peaceful afternoon was that I was being watched. Barbara Hamilton, president of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, stood at the property line, her Mercedes SUV parked behind her, taking photos of what she would later call that eyesore of a windmill. The official welcome to the neighborhood came 3 days after I moved in. A sharp knock at the door revealed a slender woman in her 50s, immaculately dressed in a cream pantsuit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. "You must be Alexis Mitchell," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Barbara Hamilton, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." I offered her coffee, which she declined with a slight grimace. "I wanted to personally welcome you to our community," she said, handing me a thick binder. "This contains all our community guidelines. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest property values in the county." Her gaze drifted past me toward the window that framed a perfect view of the water mill. "That's quite an unusual structure you have there," she said, her voice cooling several degrees. "It's a historic water mill," I explained. "It's been in my family for generations." "Well," Barbara said, her smile tightening, "I'm afraid it violates several of our community aesthetic guidelines. Section 12, Paragraph 3 specifically prohibits unsightly outbuildings and structures that detract from the uniform appearance of the neighborhood." I frowned. "I don't think that applies here. My property predates the development of Oak Ridge Estates. My grandmother made sure it was legally exempted from HOA regulations." Barbara's smile disappeared completely. "No property in Oak Ridge Estates is exempt from HOA oversight, Ms. Mitchell. I suggest you review the materials I've provided and make arrangements to have that antiquated windmill removed within 30 days. As she turned to leave, she paused. "We value community harmony here. It would be a shame to start your residency with unnecessary conflict." Once she was gone, I called my grandmother's longtime friend and neighbor, Frank Delgado. "Barbara's already been by, hasn't she?" he asked with a knowing sigh. "How did you guess?" "She's been trying to get your grandmother to remove that windmill for 15 years, Frank explained. "Eleanor fought her every step of the way. Kept all the documentation proving the property's exemption in a fireproof box." "Why is she so obsessed with it?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "Barbara believes in perfection. Conformity. That mill represents everything she can't control." What neither of us knew then was that Barbara's motives ran much deeper than simple control issues. The first official HOA violation notice arrived exactly 1 week later, slipped under my door in a bright red envelope. Violation notice, immediate attention required property, 1842 Hilltop Road violation. Unapproved structure, windmill, fine, $200 per day until removed action required. Removal within 21 days. I stared at the notice, my blood boiling. Attached was a copy of the HOA bylaws with the relevant sections highlighted. At the bottom was Barbara Hamilton's signature, the pen strokes sharp and aggressive. That afternoon, I found the fireproof box Frank had mentioned, hidden in my grandmother's study behind a false panel in the bookcase. Inside were yellowed documents dating back to 1975 when Oak Ridge Estates was first developed. The most important was a notarized agreement clearly stating, The property known as Hilltop Farm, including all existing structures, specifically the historical windmill, shall be exempt from all Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association regulations and restrictions in perpetuity. Armed with this document, I marched straight to Barbara's house, a sprawling colonial at the top of the neighborhood hill. She answered the door in gardening gloves, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Miss Hamilton," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I have the original exemption agreement right here. The mill stays." She barely glanced at the paper. "That document is nearly 50 years old and was signed under dubious circumstances. The current HOA board has reviewed the situation and determined the exemption is no longer valid." "That's not how legal agreements work," I said. Her eyes narrowed. "I've been president of this HOA for 20 years, Ms. Mitchell. I know exactly how things work around here." As she closed the door in my face, I realized this wasn't going to be resolved easily. The next day, I contacted Rachel Wong, an attorney specializing in property disputes. "This is pretty cut and dry," Rachel said after reviewing the documents. "Their exemption argument doesn't hold water legally. But HOAs can make your life difficult while you fight them. Document everything." Following her advice, I installed security cameras covering the mill and property boundaries. I also had a structural engineer inspect the mill and certify it was sound, anticipating Barbara's next move. It came 3 days later when 2 men in HOA shirts appeared at the edge of my property with measuring equipment. When I confronted them, they claimed they were conducting a safety inspection, authorized by the HOA board. "You're trespassing," I informed them. "Please leave immediately." They left, but that night, a new violation notice appeared. "Urgent safety violation, structure assessed as potentially hazardous, fine increased to $500 per day, removal deadline, 14 days. Barbara was escalating, but so was I. Rachel filed a cease and desist letter the next morning, formally notifying the HOA that any entry onto my property without permission would be treated as trespassing. At the monthly HOA meeting that week, I presented my case to the full board, showing the exemption documents and the engineer's safety certification. Several board members seemed sympathetic, but Barbara quickly silenced them. "The board has already voted," she announced firmly. "The matter is closed." As I left, a middle-aged man followed me into the parking lot. "I'm Michael Chin, HOA treasurer," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Barbara isn't telling the whole story. There's something you should know about that land your mill sits on." Before he could continue, Barbara's voice rang out from the doorway. "Michael, we need you inside." He gave me an apologetic look. "Be careful. Barbara doesn't fight fair." 2 weeks later, I had to fly across the country for my cousin's wedding. I'd be gone for 4 days. I checked all the security cameras, made sure the cease and desist letter was posted visibly at the property boundaries, and asked Frank to keep an eye on things. The wedding was beautiful, but throughout the reception, I had a nagging feeling something was wrong. When my phone rang at 2 a.m. and I saw it was Frank, my heart sank. "They're tearing it down, Alexis," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "Barbara brought in a demolition crew. They're saying it's an emergency measure because of structural concerns." "That's impossible," I said, already booking the next flight home. "We have documentation proving it's sound. They have some inspector here claiming there's rot in the support beams that could cause imminent collapse." Barbara fast-tracked an emergency removal order. I tried to stop them, but they threatened to have me arrested for interference. I arrived home 17 hours later to find my family's legacy reduced to splintered wood and rubble. The water wheel lay broken in pieces, the wooden mechanisms that had turned for nearly 2 centuries smashed beyond recognition. Standing in the midst of the destruction was Barbara Hamilton, clipboard in hand, overseeing workers as they loaded the last pieces into dumpsters. "What have you done?" I demanded, my voice breaking. She turned, not even attempting to hide her satisfaction. "Eliminated a serious safety hazard, as is my duty as HOA president. The emergency inspection revealed critical structural failures." "This was perfectly sound," I said, fighting back tears. "You know that." "Our inspector found otherwise," she replied smoothly. "Perhaps if you'd maintained it properly, but that's irrelevant now. The hazard has been removed. This was legally protected. You had no right." "Then sue me," she interrupted, checking her watch. "Though I should warn you, the HOA has very deep pockets and excellent attorneys." As she walked away, I noticed something strange in the rubble, a small metal box embedded in what had been the mill's foundation, now exposed by the demolition. I waited until Barbara and her crew were gone before examining it. The box was old, sealed with a combination lock. On top were my grandmother's initials. I tried her birthday, nothing. Then I tried the year the mill was built, 1850. The lock clicked open. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed to me in my grandmother's handwriting, along with several ancient-looking documents. My dear Alexis, the letter began, if you're reading this, someone has done what I've feared for years, destroyed our mill. What they don't know is that the mill isn't just our heritage, it's our protection. The documents inside told an incredible story. The land that now made up the eastern third of Oak Ridge Estates, including Barbara Hamilton's own property, had originally been part of the Mitchell family farm. In 1975, when developers were creating Oak Ridge Estates, Barbara's father, Richard Hamilton, had been the lead developer. He'd used falsified surveys and forged documents to claim an additional 12 acres of Mitchell land. My great-grandmother had discovered the fraud, but rather than engage in a lengthy court battle she couldn't afford, she made a deal. She would stay quiet about the land theft in exchange for permanent exemption of her remaining property from HOA rules. The water mill was specifically mentioned as the boundary marker. As long as it stood, the agreement remained in force. By destroying the mill, Barbara had unknowingly invalidated the very agreement that legitimized her claim to her own property. "Oh my God," I whispered, realizing what my grandmother had done. She hadn't just been protecting a family heirloom, she'd been protecting evidence. I called Rachel immediately. "This is extraordinary," Rachel said, carefully examining the documents. "Your grandmother was brilliant. By destroying the mill, Barbara has triggered a clause that could invalidate not just her property claim, but potentially the titles of dozens of homes in Oak Ridge Estates. What do we do? First, we document everything about the demolition. Then we file an emergency injunction to prevent any further destruction of evidence. And then," she smiled, "we prepare for battle." The injunction was granted the next day. When Barbara received notice, she immediately called an emergency HOA board meeting. Through Michael Chin, who had become my reluctant ally, I learned she was in full panic mode. "She's telling everyone you're trying to steal their homes," he reported. Most of the board doesn't believe her, especially after I showed them copies of the original agreements. "Why are you helping me?" I asked him. Michael sighed. "I've watched Barbara bully this neighborhood for years. My mother lived here before me. She always said something wasn't right about how this development was created." 2 days later, Barbara showed up at my door, her usual composure cracking around the edges. "We should discuss a settlement," she said without preamble. "The HOA is prepared to compensate you for the mill. $50,000. I shook my head. "It's not about money." $100,000 then, she said quickly. "And we'll remove all fines against your property." "Barbara," I said calmly, "do you know what was in that metal box you dug up when you demolished my mill?" The color drained from her face. "Your father stole my family's land. The mill was the only thing protecting your claim to it. And now you've destroyed it." "That's absurd," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Is it? Because I have surveys from 1974 and 1975 showing how the property lines mysteriously moved. I have the original agreement your father signed. And I have sworn testimonies from 3 people who were there when it happened." She left without another word, but that night, the real intimidation began. My security cameras caught 2 men in hoodies spray painting, "Drop the lawsuit or else," across my garage door. Their faces were covered, but one of them was wearing a distinctive Oak Ridge Estates HOA jacket. I called the police immediately. Detective Rivera arrived within minutes, reviewing the security footage with professional interest. "Well, this just went from a civil dispute to criminal intimidation," he observed. "I'll need copies of all your security footage." The next morning, Michael Chen called me in a panic. "Barbara's losing it," he said. "She called me last night asking if I knew anyone who could make your problem go away. I think she was talking about you. Did you record the conversation?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "And I've already sent it to your attorney." The case moved quickly after that. The district attorney added criminal intimidation and conspiracy charges against Barbara to our civil case. When news broke about the land fraud, several other Oak Ridge Estates residents came forward with stories of Barbara's intimidation tactics over the years. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove her as president, and property records throughout the neighborhood came under review. Barbara's attorney approached Rachel with increasingly desperate settlement offers, but I held firm. I wanted full restoration of my property, complete reconstruction of the mill, and a public apology. In the end, Barbara agreed to everything plus a substantial financial settlement. The court also mandated that the reconstructed mill be registered as a protected historical landmark, ensuring it could never be threatened again. The day construction began on the new mill, neighbors gathered to watch. Many brought old photos they'd taken of the original structure to help the builders accurately recreate every detail. Frank Delgado stood beside me, tears in his eyes. "Your grandmother would be so proud," he said. "She always said that mill would outlast us all." "In a way it has," I replied, watching as the new foundation stones were carefully laid. Barbara Hamilton sold her house and moved away before the mill was completed. I heard she relocated to a high-rise condo in the city, no HOA involved. 6 months later, I stood before the fully restored water wheel, watching as water from the stream caught its blades and set it turning for the first time. The craftsmanship was impeccable. It looked exactly as it had for generations, but with modern engineering ensuring it would stand for centuries more. The official historical landmark plaque gleamed in the sunlight. Riverview Mill EST 1850. A testament to heritage, perseverance, and justice-protected historical landmark. Michael Chin, now the new HOA president, approached me at the dedication ceremony. "The board approved new bylaws yesterday," he said. "No changes to historical properties without owner consent, and all HOA decisions must now be transparent and put to community vote." I smiled. Sounds like real progress. As the celebration continued around me, I thought about what my grandmother had done. She hadn't just protected a building, she created a legacy of standing up to bullies and fighting for what's right, even if the victory might come after her time. Barbara thought she was destroying a simple water mill. Instead, she'd walked right into a trap that had been waiting for decades. She never understood that true power isn't about control or intimidation. It's about protecting what matters no matter how long it takes. What would you do if someone tried to destroy your family's legacy? Have you ever dealt with an out-of-control HOA or neighborhood bully? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story of justice served, make sure to like, subscribe, and share with friends who love seeing entitled people get exactly what they deserve.